Hey everyone, welcome back to Noodle Food. Today we are going to be talking again about the coronavirus. I'm basically going to be updating the analysis I had done about a month ago. And we're going to start by looking at that same chart that I had shown you about a month ago. And this was looking at the cases in China and how quickly they had been doubling. And basically they had been doubling about every 2.5 days. As some of you pointed out in the comments in the previous video, what is more likely is that the virus was actually doubling a good bit slower than every 2.5 days. It's just either the information was suppressed or the authorities weren't aware of it. And so it's more likely that it was probably doubling like every 4 days. So the real curve was something slower to get to this point. We're going to take a look at the current chart for the same thing. This is mainland China. How many confirmed cases are there? I have circled here where the last video was released. That red circle is basically when we released the last video, and then after that you can see it continued to rise, but essentially at a linear rate. And it looked like it was slowing down. Then they announced a huge amount of more new cases, and the cases that they announced here, this was due to there weren't enough tests available or time to give all the tests. And so there were a lot of people who doctors thought had coronavirus, but they couldn't confirm it with a lab test. And this basically, there was a window here where they were allowed to confirm patients who they think had coronavirus. And that's why the numbers jumped up so much here. Shortly after, they actually reversed that decision. And then those cases stopped being included, but these ones were already grandfathered in, so the graph didn't go back down or anything. The reason for the reversal was because when you are basing your diagnosis only on symptoms, people with the bad flu, they can appear to have the coronavirus, but really it's just the flu. The problem of basically this measurement is you're only catching people who have been tested and tested positive. And there's a lot of people who probably have it, but don't have symptoms and aren't being tested. So this is somewhat of an underestimate, but what's of course most important to pull away from this graph is that instead of it exploding exponentially up towards, we should be at several million now if it continued at the previous growth rate or anything close to it. Instead, it's leveled off and there's every day fewer cases than the day before. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is what was the effort that China put in place to contain this from spreading throughout all of China, more than it has already. And there's a few layers. The first layer is basically the city and town quarantine. So at a national level, they prevented movement, especially from infected cities towards other areas. So Wuhan, the biggest city in Hubei that was infected, it was completely shut off from the rest of the world and you could not get in or out. Many small villages and towns around Rosso, they basically had any way in or out of the town. Was completely shut down, roadblocked. You couldn't move in or out of these cities. There were some ethical concerns because healthy people were obviously being trapped in cities with sick people, but at a national level, it was preventing the sickest people from leaving Hubei province and potentially infecting the rest of China and thereby slowing the spread of the disease. So that was the first level. Within a province, though, or within a city, many, especially at the beginning of February, most businesses were completely shut down. You couldn't even go to work. Schools were shut down, and people were basically working from home, if working at all. Obviously, that was a pretty severe measure because it basically ground a lot of the Chinese economy to a halt. Late February, so this is now a week and a half ago, about 45% of firms said they had no way to resume work, mostly due to labor shortages. And this is largely due to migrant populations. So within China, there's a lot of people who live in the countryside but work in the industrial areas. Over the new year, they might have gone home to visit family. And all these people can't return to their jobs because they're stuck in home quarantine. Over the past few weeks, these companies have been finding other workers or finding ways to get these workers back and getting them health tested or potentially put into a small quarantine. So when they come back, they don't infect other workers in the various industries. At its peak, provinces representing about 70% of China's economy were closed for business. Now, this isn't the case anymore. I want to emphasize the extreme drastic measures that were taken to control the epidemic. Basically, people didn't go to work in a huge portion of the country for a rather long period of time. The harsher measures have been pulled back, but there's still lingering effects. The next effort in the quarantine was quarantining residential complexes. So this is an example of residential complex or apartment building in China that's been put under quarantine. And basically, people are supposed to stay in their homes or their apartments To leave, they need to get permission, and you can usually only leave, once a day or a couple times a week. And often what will happen if you're going to leave, you'll end up doing kind of errands for multiple people in the apartment complex. You can imagine having this done wherever you live, being done not for like a day or two, but being done for a month or 2 months. It's an extremely severe quarantine. And if anybody, the way it was done is if anybody was infected in that apartment complex, then the whole complex was put under quarantine. And then the next step was they built tons of hospitals for quarantining patients in Wuhan. They had 16 temporary hospitals, and they boosted the total number of beds in Wuhan from 5,000 up to around 23,000. It was kind of a miracle how quickly they were able to build some of these. And I think there was a collapse on one of them recently, but just heroic efforts to set up all of these hospitals so quickly and then move in nursing staff and doctors from all over the country to staff them. But at a province or city level, this was now even though the residential complexes which infected people came from were put under quarantine, it's also getting the sick people as much as they could out of those units and into quarantine hospitals. Social distancing was the other part, and social distancing is basically canceling public events, rescheduling them, and when people are in public, trying not to be too close to other people. But these were things that were done and continue to be done in China. So to kind of summarize so far, we have things that are done kind of at the national level to quarantine whole towns and cities. We have things that are done at the city level to quarantine workplaces, apartment complexes, and then sick individuals. And then there's a bunch of policies that were at the personal level, right? So you have to wear masks in public. It's not optional. It's led to huge demand increases for mask products. Like on Amazon, the 4533 sanitary dust mask, it started at $8, but it eventually rose to $200 for that pack. So there's just been an enormous demand. And unfortunately, a lot of this demand is panic buying. It's people who don't really need it, but they want to have it in case there's not going to be enough masks, which is a very reasonable concern because the world is going to need a lot more of these masks in the coming few months than it has right now. The problem, though, is that this panic buying prevents people who actually need masks today from being able to get it, especially at a reasonable price. Some of the things that have been done, like in Hong Kong, that were pretty effective to prevent this kind of panic buying, and then ultimately, if the people who need them can't get the masks, the disease spreads more. So it's a really bad thing. So anyway, they basically set up rations or limits where they made sure there were enough masks in the pharmacies for everybody to have 10 to use for 10 days. And so they basically prevented people from buying more than 10 every 10 days. And anyway, that did something probably to curtail the hoarding and panic buying of masks, but it's actually a real issue. Masks in public are not optional. Also, people are spending a very limited amount of time in public, and it's changed, and it matters which province you are in China, but in some provinces, you basically aren't hardly ever in public anymore in Hubei. But other places you can go, but you need permission, and then other places it's not so severe at all. It's more business as usual. Certainly in the more infected areas, the streets are kind of empty. It looks a lot like a ghost town. Another thing that's changed a lot, especially in Hubei, is the use of delivery couriers. So JD Logistics, one of the country's biggest logistics kind of courier companies, said they're hiring 20,000 more warehouse workers and couriers to meet this surge demand during the outbreak. And all these people who are doing the courier service, it's probably a somewhat thankless and certainly very risky job. They are having to interact with a ton of people. Almost certainly a large number of them are sick. You look at how many deliveries they make. Probably near the risk level of being a health professional in one of the infected cities. But it just goes to show you how much life has changed, especially in the most affected cities, and how intense the quarantine was to actually control this. And the final part is health screening. And health screening comes in a few flavors. The gold standard is the fluid or blood lab test. And if you want to find out for certain if you have coronavirus, they're going to want to take fluid swabs, like swabs from your mouth, or they're going to want you to cough up something, or they're going to most likely get a blood sample from you also. And they're going to send those off to a lab, and there's a couple different types of tests that they run in the lab that will determine whether you're positive or negative for the coronavirus and what kind of strain you have. So that's the gold standard. The problem is there's a limited capacity in terms of how many of these tests you can do in a country. But you can't be doing that, it's not fast. you have limited capacity. So what they've also been doing is CT scans of the lungs. And if you look at the white arrows, they're pointing towards this ground glass complexion area of the lungs. And this is an indicator that you have coronavirus. Unfortunately, if you have pneumonia or the flu, it can also show up similarly. That's one of the reasons it's not necessarily a great test. It's more like an indicator. But people who have severe cases of the coronavirus also, tend to have these symptoms. So this is one of the ways where they were diagnosing people. And this is when you saw that massive uptick in the coronavirus charts, a lot of this was CT scans that were used to diagnose people as having the coronavirus. And the final method is scanning body temperature, looking for people with fevers. A lot of people who have coronavirus have no symptoms at all, and they certainly don't have a fever, even if they develop a fever later. So it's not a perfect way, but in airports, in places of transit, going into workplaces, going into the grocery store, you'll find somebody at the entrance that's going to scan almost everybody entering or leaving. And it's not perfect, but it's one more layer of protection to try to keep sick people from infecting others. So when you sum all of this up, you see what a massive effort China has been through to control the spread of this disease. And it's truly amazing, the scale of it. I hope that has hit you after watching this so far. With that, we're going to continue now to talk about the spread of the coronavirus outside of China. When I had done this video about a month ago, we looked at it, and there were about 400 cases almost worldwide. Not even. I think there were like 350. And at this point in time, when we were looking at it, it looked like the virus was doubling about every 4 days, but it was hard to say because a lot of these cases at this time were people who had come from China and they were being kept in quarantine in these new countries. And so it wasn't certain if there was really, community spread of the disease where, somebody was sick and they were giving it to somebody else within that country. That's kind of what we were looking at here. And if we look at this chart today, if we look at where we were back around February 6th, it's way back here. And as you can see, we have community spread now across the world. It is growing very rapidly. If you look at the days to double, which is the metric we were looking at, it was about 7 days for a while, and then it's been between 4 and 3. So I would say it's about 4 days to double, which is an extremely fast growth rate compared to other diseases. It does appear to be spreading very, very quickly. And we'll take a look at the world map to see where all it is. So this is the world map of the coronavirus. It's made it to every single continent. We have community spread in every continent. The most affected places outside of China are South Korea, which has 7,000, and then Italy is just right behind it. And it's by the time I put this video up, Italy is probably ahead of South Korea in terms of number of cases. Iran has over 6,000. France has over 1,000. Germany has over 1,000. And these are the ones we know about. The other right here, this is the Diamond Princess plus maybe a few. No, this is just the Diamond Princess, actually. So this is the cruise ship. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then Spain, and then the US, which is where I live, it has 547. And then we can see Japan, Switzerland, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden. All of these have a lot. And the list goes on. This is just a portion of the list. But basically, it has a foothold everywhere. And it's getting to the point, if you have 1 or 2 cases, the way you quarantine these things at an individual level is you find out everybody who may have come into contact with that person, and you try to find them and you put them in quarantine. And if you do that, then you may get that last case gone. But it is spread so many places that it just looks completely out of control in terms of, is this something that will ever, completely go away? There's a few things I want to call your attention to, though. It's Korea and Italy. And if you look at South Korea has 7,000 something. They have about the same number of cases. But Italy has 366 deaths, and South Korea has 50 deaths. And you may ask yourself, is it a much more deadly strain of the virus that has entered Italy than has entered South Korea? The answer, we of course don't exactly know. I mean, there are scientists that have mapped out all the different strains and they could probably tell you. I don't actually know the answer to that. There are different strains and some are more deadly than others, which is interesting, but I'm not going to get into that here. What is more likely the actual cause of this is that South Korea has been testing far, far more people. They have tested 170,000 people. Meanwhile, Italy has tested about 36,000 people. And if you look at just as a ratio to a percent of the population, how many tests have we given per million people? It's about 3,400 tests in South Korea. So they have been going gangbusters testing people to identify who's infected so they can isolate them. And if you look at Italy, they have only tested about 600 people per million. If we come back and then look at these numbers again in light of that, what it most likely represents is that there are a lot more infected people in Italy that we don't know about because we haven't tested them yet. So that is the truly frightening thing. And Korea actually, and I don't have these charts, but maybe in a future video or something we can put them on there. But Korea actually, the number of new cases per day, they still have a fair number of new cases per day, but they have been coming down. Even though Korea has the most cases outside of China, the number of new cases per day has started to come down for a few days now, or maybe even for a little over a week. And that is very big news for Korea. It means, it's kind of a turning point. But that was largely done, by getting to this point where they're testing enough people to pull out all the infected folks and isolate them into quarantine. This is particularly important when we come down and we look at other countries, like we look at Finland, which hasn't tested many people, or the United States, which has hardly performed any tests. If we come back and we look at the total numbers, the US, you'll see, has over 500 confirmed cases, 547 at the time of this recording. If you look at how many tests we've given in the US, of course, where I'm from, it's only 1,800. Of all the tests we've given, a quarter of them have been positive. Meanwhile, in South Korea, they've given 178,000 tests. And how many of them were positive? Not nearly as many, only 7,000. And then if you look at it as a percent of the population, or like how many tests are we giving per million people, in the US it's only 6. Compared to Italy, which we were kind of ragging on compared to South Korea, which is 600 per million. The problem, I think, with these epidemics or these diseases is if you look at what China had to do to end up controlling it, all the investment is kind of extreme and people don't want to make it. Politicians don't want to appear overly concerned and put people to a panic and drive the economy into the ground and other things like that. But to get out in front of it, you have to realize that a lot of the people who have the disease are not showing symptoms. And that is what we're going to talk about next. This lesson is basically going to be best demonstrated by looking at the Diamond Princess. And the Diamond Princess was the cruise ship that was quarantined off the coast of Japan. The story behind it is actually quite interesting. One person on it, February 1st, I think he landed in Hong Kong. He landed, basically found out that he had the coronavirus. The cruise ship company was notified. And so they then took the ship, which the guy had disembarked from. And I think it was a new set of passengers on the ship also. And they quarantined it. On February 4th, they found 10 passengers on it had tested positive. So we're not going to allow people off the ship, go into Japan. We're not going to allow the ship to move on to the next destination. We're putting the ship in quarantine. And there's a bunch of controversy over whether it's even ethical to do that, or whether you need to get the people off the ship where they are going to be much safer and put them in a different kind of quarantine, like a non-ship quarantine, which seems to be the better way to do it. So the next thing that happens is on February 26th, they test, and this has been happening all up until this point, but by February 26th, they've tested 4,060 people. And of those, 705 people have tested positive for coronavirus. Now, what's particularly important about this, and we really would only see it on the cruise ship, is that 392 have no symptoms. And what is so important about this is that most countries, like China, if you were deadly ill at the beginning, you couldn't even get a test. There weren't enough tests going around. I mean, some people obviously got tested. It was very hard to get the test due to test availability. Certainly, if you had no symptoms at all, you weren't going to go volunteer and just say, hey, test me. And if you did, you would not get tested. I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. But most of the people, 392 of the 705 who tested positive, had no symptoms at all. They didn't have a fever. They had nothing. Now, a significant portion of them would go on to develop symptoms later. And I don't know what percent ended up developing symptoms. It may have been all, it may not have been. But that's really important because it changes how you approach the disease. You can't, if you're only testing people who have symptoms. You are never going to get out ahead of the virus. And that's why, coming back, when you look at South Korea, why you can see they've actually started to be able to get out in front of the virus is they're testing a lot of people. And that's basically what you have to do, amongst some of the other things. The final thing we're going to talk about, and then we might have some kind of closing thoughts where I ramble, is how dangerous is it? And if you look at the mortality rates within China, depending on which province you look at, you can find it's pretty low, less than 1%. And then if you look at, nationwide, or if you look at Hubei, which is going to make up most of the nation's patients in general, and then also certainly deaths, it looks like the mortality rate is closer to like 1 to 4%. And then if you look at Italy, if we go way back, Italy has obviously a pretty high, I haven't actually run the numbers, but I think it's actually pretty close to 4%. Anyway, but if we break it down and we look at the different age groups, who's at risk, here you can see that if you're over 80, it's not looking good. It's almost like a 15% mortality rate. If you're under 50, it's not very bad. I mean, I say not very bad, but if you're one of the people, if you're one of the people who's in this 0.4%, it's extremely bad. And for all the people who aren't dying, there's a lot of people who are going to be if you've ever had the flu, it's horrible. So there's a ton of people who really suffer with the disease, even if they're fortunate enough to survive. But overall, I think the World Health Organization came out with an estimate saying they're saying the official mortality rate is 3.5% or 3.4%. But people do different studies and come to different conclusions, and it's going to matter the kind of healthcare you get and all these other things. If you have a pre-existing condition, like you have cardiovascular disease, or you have diabetes, or you have a chronic respiratory disease or hypertension or cancer, the death rates increase dramatically. Though there's going to be, if you have one of these conditions, you're probably more likely to be older as well. And then males are at greater risk of death than females too. So how dangerous is it? Well, it's pretty dangerous. I probably should have a flu number. Let me get the flu number for you. So if you look at the flu is around 0.1 to 0.2%. It's like 0.15%. So it's almost about 10 times more dangerous than the flu. And I think that leaves us now with what to do and what going forward. And if we want to summarize, the virus is completely out of control. It is no longer contained. It is all over the world. We have community spread basically everywhere. The vaccine is not complete yet. Hopefully it finishes soon. And in some ways, this is a race a little bit between how well the disease can be contained before the vaccine comes out. Most likely going to be a part of life going forward. Now, it's not an apocalypse. Unfortunately, sometimes the quarantine measures can make it feel apocalyptic. Because it really can change the way life works once you start really implementing a severe quarantine. But hopefully we don't have to get to that point. So in my opinion, a policy objective should be avoiding getting to the point where you need a quarantine so intense and so severe that it feels like an apocalyptic setting. Now, the disease itself is definitely not going to be apocalyptic. It's bad. It's worse than the flu. And if you think about how much misery, I think most of you watching this have probably had the flu at some point. And if you sum up all the pain and misery that the flu has caused, and then, there's also a survivor bias, and those of you who are watching, none of you died from the flu. But if you sum up all of the pain and misery caused by the flu, it's a lot. And this is potentially going to cause a lot more pain and misery than the flu did. So I think it's definitely something worth taking seriously, and hopefully we can prevent it from spreading too much or spreading more slowly until there's a vaccine out. And if enough people get vaccinated quickly enough, potentially we could send this virus on the run. But for now, the vaccine isn't in the cards. So the best remedy is aggressive testing. And in the US in particular, which is where I'm from, I think it's particularly important that people who are sick get tested. And probably this sort of testing needs to be free, because there's an immense public cost to somebody who's sick not getting tested and treated, and instead spreading the disease to many, many more people. So anyway, that is the update complete. I hope you've learned something. I hope this also doesn't put you into a panic, but I hope it also makes you a bit alert as to what is going on. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Also, I'll add, if you enjoyed watching this and you found it informative and you learned something, I'd ask you share it with some of your friends. This is obviously a pretty small channel that's just getting started, so I think unless a few of you share it with friends, it's probably not going to reach too many people. And I think the more people that are better informed about this situation, the better. Thanks.